a brief video reminding you about the causes of World War II. Really important topic. Let's go through it as quickly as we can. So what do we know? We know that World War II began on the 1st of September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. And we know that that came about as a result, that action of German foreign policy. Don't forget what foreign policy is. That's how one country interacts with and treats another country. Okay? Now, Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany. And he came to power with a very clear message about what he wanted to do in terms of foreign policy. He said he wanted to build a third German Reich. The word Reich is the German word for empire. So there had been two German empires previously. The second one had ended with the ending of World War I in 1918 and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And Hitler said when he returned to power, he was going to return Germany to its rightful position as an empire. He had written in his book, Mein Kampf, that he was going to expand German territory in the east in something which he called Lebensraum, which translates as living space. He was going to conquer Eastern Europe. He was going to create space for Germany to expand. Of course, the question then is, what happens to all the millions of people who live in, what we today call Poland and, the Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and all these areas in Eastern Europe? Well, Hitler said that they were Untermensch because they were Slavs. Slavs is the ethnic group to which many Eastern Europeans belonged. Untermensch means subhuman. That's a disgusting term. Hitler was a dirty racist. But he was a dirty racist who gained a lot of power. And he believed that he was part of the master race. That's what the word Herrenvolk means, master people or master race. And he believed it was perfectly fine for him to take control of Eastern Europe and essentially turn the population of Eastern Europe into slaves who would work, those who were left alive, who would work to the benefit of the German Empire. So it's, when you think about it now, when you listen to that stuff now, right, you think, my God, that can't be real. That's nuts. That's mad. But of course it was real. And there, throughout history, and even today, you look what's happening in the world today, there are people out there who don't think like the rest of us, who think that, we are somehow inferior to them and will therefore walk or try to walk all over us. And that was Hitler, okay? So he was furious about the Treaty of Versailles. Don't forget the Treaty of Versailles was a humiliation for Germany. Okay, you need to learn your terms of the Treaty of Versailles. I'm going to roll them off really, really quickly. It ended the German Empire. It limited the German army to 100,000 men when it had been, in the millions prior to and during the First World War. It said Germany could effectively have no air force and a very limited navy. It took away any German foreign possessions in Africa and Asia and so on. It forced Germany to accept that it caused World War I. That's called the War Guilt Clause. Germany was banned from ever uniting with Austria in something called Anschluss, because that would have made the united German state too powerful. Germany was forced to pay over 6 billion English pounds sterling in compensation for the war. So there's no doubt that Versailles was a humiliation for Germany, and Hitler said he wanted revenge for it. How do you get revenge against Britain and France? You go to war. So as soon as he came to power in 1933, the German army, expanded. Conscription, that's compulsory military service, was introduced. And, not caring about the Treaty of Versailles, he began to build an air force. And he essentially said, right, if you're not happy, come and do something about it. Because he knew that Britain and France, had no appetite for another war with Germany. The war with Germany in 1933 had only been over for 15 years. Britain and France suffered greatly during that first war. Nobody was going to go and look for a war. And a lot of people by 1933 felt that Versailles was unfair anyway. A lot of people by 1933 felt that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, mainly dictated by France, were unduly harsh. So they weren't going to look to go to war with Germany for building an air force or for having an army. So Hitler grew in confidence because he started breaking the rules and nobody did anything about it. By 1936, he decides he's going to march his army into the Rhineland, which is this region in western Germany, which borders France, which France had insisted could have no German armed forces to act like almost like a security blanket for France in case of German invasion. So he orders his troops into the Rhineland. France does nothing because she's afraid to act on her own. There's no appetite for war in Britain. Hitler looks like a hero and he feels emboldened that he can do whatever the hell he wants to do, dismantling the Treaty of Versailles, because Britain and France will not be strong enough to stand up to him. In 1936, he bolsters his own confidence by signing a deal with the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini called the Rome-Berlin Axis. Again, makes him feel strong. And between 1936 and 1939, during the Spanish Civil War, Hitler sent his air force, or elements of his air force, called the Luftwaffe, to Spain, essentially to get experience in warfare. Again, all of this consciously building up to a conflict that he knew was coming. We call it the Second World War, but he knew war was coming. And famously, the German Condor Legion carried out an incredibly cruel aerial bombing of a town in northern Spain called Guernica, which kind of set the tone for what was coming later on. It set the tone for the Blitz in 1940 in London, and of course the terrible bombing of German cities later on in the First World War. So we know that Anschluss was the idea that Germany would unite with Austria. Hitler tried to complete Anschluss in 1934-35, failed. By 1938, for reasons I won't go into now, the Austrian government, which was a Nazi government, invited the Germans in, and Anschluss happened. Austria became part of Germany, known as Ostmark. And did Britain and France do anything? No. Why? Well, because people said, we're not going to go to war over that. That's a load of Germans who want to live together. Okay, but again, it made Hitler confident that Britain and France would do nothing because of the horror of World War I, which was so fresh, and also because of this idea of the policy of appeasement. And that word appeasement is really important. Really, really, really important. You have to know what it means. It's the policy of giving a bully what they want to avoid a fight. It was a policy that was very popular in Britain in the 1930s. And essentially what it meant was, look, if he's looking for things that are reasonable, if he wants to join together with Austria and Austria wants to join together with him, we're not going to go to war over that. If he wants to, grow his army, what right do we have to tell him how big his army is? We're not going to go to war over that. If he wants to march his army into a part of his own country, and annoy the French, well, we're not going to go to war over that. So these factors explain why Britain in particular didn't react when they could have reacted against Hitler earlier. And the fact that Britain was reluctant to act was the reason that France didn't react, because France knew that taking on Germany on her own was very dangerous. The big crisis came in September 1938. One of the things that the Treaty of Versailles did was create a number of new countries that hadn't existed before by breaking up old countries. And one of those new countries was called Czechoslovakia. Today, it's two different countries, the Czech Republic or Czechia, it's known as, isn't it? And Slovakia. But at that time, it was a country that sat to the south of Germany and had a region in it which bordered Germany called the Sudetenland, which essentially means the southeast territory. And the Sudetenland used to belong to Austria and Germany, but it was a line drawn on a map in 1919 meant it became part of Czechoslovakia, and there were 3 million ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland who didn't want to be in Czechoslovakia, they wanted to be in Germany. And by 1938, late 1938, feeling like really confident that Britain and France would do nothing, Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be returned to Germany by the Czechs, and he said, if you don't return it, I'm going to invade. Okay, there's going to be a war. Now, the Czechs needed help. They had allies. They were allied with Britain and France, and they needed help if Germany was going to invade. Czechs were very, very, very prepared for war, but, a very small country has no chance against a country like Germany. And so a conference was arranged to see if they could, prevent war. It was held in the southern German city of Munich. And of course, the Czechs were sold out. They weren't even invited to the conference. Hitler met with Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. Mussolini was also there, so was the French Premier Daladier. And they reached a deal, and the deal was very simple. Hitler said, give me the Sudetenland, and I promise you that's the end of it. I don't want the rest of Czechoslovakia. Sure, that's full of Czechs and Slovaks. All I want is the part that has Germans in it. And that's the end. I won't look for any more territory. So Chamberlain signed a deal, and Daladier signed a deal with Hitler. And Chamberlain famously went back to London and got out of the plane, and what is now, I think it was at Heathrow. It wasn't called Heathrow then, but it's where Heathrow is now. And he, famously gave his, speech in which he said that he had held up his little piece of paper which contained peace for our time, and he couldn't be more wrong. He thought he had done a deal with Hitler, but he didn't. Hitler was a dishonest man. By March 1939, Hitler, who said he had no interest in taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia, sends his army into the rest of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France do nothing, but from this point forward, they know they can't trust him. They begin to kind of panic and prepare for war. The only problem Hitler had was worrying if he was going to go to war with France and Britain on one side, for what would in Germany be what we call the Western Front. Well, he didn't want to have to turn around and fight a war with the Soviet Union, who were his natural enemy, on the Eastern Front. So, he shocked the world and signed a deal with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which essentially gave him the green light. He wanted to invade Poland. He didn't think Poland deserved to exist. He said Poland was German territory, and he wanted to essentially return it to Germany. And Stalin and him reached a deal where Stalin would take the eastern part of Poland and he would take the western part of Poland. And so in September 1939, Poland was invaded. 3 days later, Britain and France, which had eventually reached the point where they realised we can't avoid war here, had told Hitler, out you go, get out of Poland, and if you don't, we're going to declare war. And unfortunately for the world, on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany and World War II began. So there you go. That's the story of how the causes of World War II.